Marriage has been weaponized in Western Christianity. Giving has been weaponized in Western Christianity. Sexuality has been weaponized. For example, any woman listening to this can attest in our culture. Don't be no 30, 35-year-old single black woman and go to the family reunion. All the older women are gonna do them. They're gonna look at you and wonder, why you not married?
Where your man at? Where your kids at?
Okay, this is really interesting because I'm trying to think, how many decades have we been in the era, the strong and independent, I don't need a man era? Like, that's been going on for some time. Y'all remember that documentary? I shared about it a while back, The Vanishing Black Family. That was back in like the 70s. So there's certainly been a subset of Black America that has generations upon generations upon generations of single women who like legitimately do not think men are necessary. Now, I think what he is probably referring to is church culture. It is true within churches. Look, I grew up in Black church. I was going to Baptist church. I was going to Church of God in Christ, Kojic, Black Pentecostal, all them churches. I also been to white church, right? So yes, in church culture, there is definitely a high emphasis on marriage. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, honestly, especially with all the moral decay or the moral decline that's going on in the West, the United States in particular. I actually think society could benefit more from strong, godly marriages that are built upon covenant and commitment to one another, and then ultimately commitment to building a better legacy. But I do think it's important to provide context, because I can't necessarily say that it is the majority experience for Black women to feel pressured by older generations of women when we've literally had decades of feminism, right? That took off, especially in the 70s and after, where women are really being empowered. So by now, like, that's a few generations of women who were very much doing things on their own and teaching their daughters how to do things on their own. But like I said, in church culture, it's a little different. But let's continue.
Like, it's a prerequisite for identity and value, that if you don't have a man, if you don't have kids, that something about you is broken. Do you understand how dysfunctional these messages are? Yeah. And how we super spiritualize these messages? Paul said, but marriage is a necessary distraction. I have many friends that were in ministry at church, and the church has told them, if you're gonna be in ministry, you can't be single. We're not going to let you work with the youth ministry if you're single. You can't do this. I believe that marriage.
Okay, this is a tough one, because I do agree that there are definitely times and cases where things in church can be off balance. We've all seen this. Many of us are the product of this. Some people don't even attend services anymore because they feel like it's all a farce. So I can understand that. I can understand that there have been toxic, imbalanced messages about just marriage, relationship, and just being single in general. I think what has to be clarified, though, when he's referring to 1 Corinthians, right? And he's talking about that passage where the Apostle Paul is basically explaining, single life versus married life. And Apostle Paul, he's like, look, I wish y'all were single like me. Apostle Paul was like, I prefer being single. Like, this is my happy place. I wish you could be that. But also, to be clear, as a Christ follower, to be single is to be celibate. It's not, okay, you're single, but you're hopping around and you're kind of like tasting the rainbow and you're sleeping around, not committing, having all these different sexual escapades, but then going to church on Sunday. No, if you are a devout follower of Yahweh, right? If you're a Christ follower, to be single is to be celibate. And so Paul in that passage is saying, I prefer this way of living because, there's a lot less distraction and I can just focus solely on my relationship with God. But most of y'all don't have the discipline to be single and sexually celibate. Most of y'all don't have that discipline. So it's actually better for you to just go on ahead and get married so you're not tempted to fall into sexual discipline. So I think it's important to set that context, because while I do think what Kirk Franklin is saying has some element of truth to it, we have to remember we also live in a society where everything is sexual, hypersexual, sexualized everywhere. And so for a woman to be deep into her 30s, 40s, 50s and single, trying to serve the Lord, it's really hard to do that if you're single and remain celibate and also keep yourself sexually pure. It's very hard to do that unless you are sexually suppressed at some point or have some other sexual trauma or something else going on. So I understand what he's saying, but context matters. And I personally do not believe that it is the perfect intention of the Most High for there to be an entire generation of people who are going deep, 30s, 40s, 50s, even on, waiting for a perfect spouse, when for the majority of time that has not happened. So, but it definitely brings up an interesting discussion. Let's continue.
Single. And so what people do, they quickly get married thinking that they're fulfilling God's will for their lives, but they are fulfilling man's dogma. You can be single and be used by God. You can be single and have purpose. Being married is not a prerequisite for God's hand on your life. It is not, but we've weaponized it.
I agree. I agree with that. Obviously, just because you're single doesn't mean that you are, by definition, a heathen or unsaved or whatever. Like, obviously, God can move and bless a person and walk with them single or unmarried. So I don't think that point is controversial.
It's not, but we've weaponized it. And then crucify people. Where my camera at?
Right
and
there.
And then crucify people when those same marriages
Damn!
Single. And so what people do, they quickly get married.
So I actually totally agree with this point, because I have seen people rush to try to get engaged or to get married just to fit a role, just so they can get in ministry or do whatever, and it blows up in their face. So I completely agree with him. Now, I don't think that in any way, shape, or form minimizes the importance of marriage, especially in the church and what the marriage actually represented biblically. I don't think that that's wrong inherently, but I do agree that there should be probably more of a focus on actually ensuring that, like, the person that you're seeking to marry really is a part of God's will for your life, and not forcing something, like not doing something to try to make folks happy, but really seeking the counsel of God and being like, is this really who I'm supposed to be with? And is this really the timing? So I do agree with him when it comes to that. Like, folks sometimes rush into marriage or rush into relationship before they've really had a chance to vet and really seek out the counsel of God themselves and confirm whether or not that's their spouse. And it goes sour quickly. Okay, and so of course you had some folks in the comment section who were in agreement. Let's see what they had to say. This one says, while I'm not closely involved with the church, I gotta say watching Kirk Franklin's evolution over the years has been refreshing to see. One of the biggest voices in gospel speaking on this is indicative of so much unlearning and healing. I love to see it. Okay, this one over here says, I need someone to talk about these Kirk Franklin interviews because this man is spitting. This is the space that he's in. Is one I respect so much, and the conversations are ones I really hope the church and I will be able to have. So again, no, I do believe as somebody who grew up in church and somebody who's still very involved in church, you need to have those tough conversations, because a lot of people are traumatized. A lot of people have had all kind of weird experiences. I have had countless weird experiences in my church journey. Okay. And again, that's not to undermine, because there are like legitimate ministries out there who I believe are, again, legit, and they are really helping building up God's people. That absolutely happens. But there's also the toxic ones. So I do think it's important to have those conversations that are uncomfortable, but can really help decipher man's dogma and trying to force people to do things and trying to force people to get caught up in just a ritual so that you can please a pastor, versus what is actually God calling these people to do, because the two are not always the same. And when you get those two mixed up, that's how people get hurt. Read this. It says, Kirk Franklin is right. No one listens to a woman if she's single. The church will make your being single at 35 seem like you need deliverance or healing. No day passes that a single woman isn't being dragged on the pulpit subtly. Marriage is being weaponized against women. Okay. I do think it's important, again, here to recognize context, because I could think of ministries off the top of my head right now that are ran by single women. You got, what's her name? Princess Balimzi, Catherine Pick, she's been blowing up, Victoria Rinci. Off the top of my head, I can think of women who ministries that are ran by women. So I don't think that's always true. Now, maybe historically in certain contexts, yes. In certain denominations, yes, you have certain denominations who are like, women need to be quiet all the time. You have some denominations that allow women to lead ministry. Look at Joyce Meyer's ministry, right? Like, she has a husband, so she's submitted, but she is still kind of like leading the ministry. So context matters. This is not always the case, but I understand what they're saying. In some cases it has been. Another one says, weaponize against women, but not the men. Men never get the same amount of shaming as women do. I do not agree with that, because I think men are oftentimes shamed to take single mothers. Men are oftentimes shamed to step up, be the dad, the stepdad, and to essentially to commit to the oftentimes overwhelming majority of women who outnumber men by like 5-1, sometimes 10-1. So I do think men are shamed. They might be shamed in a different kind of way, but they are definitely shamed. And again, this can change by denomination. Let's see. Says Kirk Frank. Okay, let's see this one. It says Kirk Franklin isn't wrong in what he's saying. People quickly get married because they don't want to live in sin, sex outside of marriage. So if you want to worship God, do it fully. You don't have to be married, but at the same time, you have to live according to God's will. What I found in my spiritual journey and just my church journey in general is that if you don't teach people why, and ultimately allow people to come to their own revelation as to why they're doing what they're doing, essentially have people decide whether or not they really want to follow God or follow Christ on their own or not, it just gets weird. And then people end up usually getting abused, misused, controlled, or all kind of different weird stuff happen. Because even if you look at the Bible, like Jesus was not trying to minister to everybody. He was very clear. He was like, count the cost. Like, do you really want to follow me or not? Like, he was not seeker friendly. And so I think what happens is sometimes you got these churches where they're so about trying to get like as many people as possible, and then have as many people as possible fit the vision of the pastor. And it gets weird because it's like the gospel was never about that. The gospel was always about, are you going to follow Christ? Are you going to lay down your life, take on his ways and his principles, learn about him and everything that comes to that? Are you going to be a living sacrifice or not? It's that simple. You're following God and everything that comes with it, or you are not, or you're not. But I think, unfortunately, there are some ministries who they really just kind of stepped away from the purity of the gospel. But what I think, unfortunately, what's happened sometimes is you have some ministries who have just stepped away from the purity of the gospel of, you want to follow Christ. You believe he is your savior from yourself, from your own life of sin, and that he is connecting you back to the source, connecting you back to the Father, and you are learning a completely new way of living. Like, they just don't preach that. They preach, give the pastor some money and some tithes and some offerings, do these particular things to basically fit into the vision of the man of God. And like I said, that goes sour. And so I think a lot of what we're seeing here is folks who are just traumatized, perhaps because they are in ministries and they themselves did not have their own conviction and their own revelation as to why they decided to live according to God's ways. Me personally, I don't feel like you need to try to force folks to be in the church or try to force folks to follow God. It don't work like that, because Jesus never did that. He was like, I'm going over here, you follow me or you don't follow me. That's how we did things. And I think we would get a lot farther if we just allowed people to make their own choices. Like, just preach the word for what it is, allow people to make their own choices, and then let God be the judge. That's just my 2 cents. Let's see if anything else here. It says, to be honest, Kirk Franklin video struck a nerve. As you get older, it's very hard when pressures from society are put on you as to what a woman should be based on age. Oh, here's one thing that I can say. I do agree with what he said about, basically, it gets weird in church. Folks be rushing into marriages and those marriages blow up. I get it. He also mentioned that sometimes women, they get to a certain age and they're not married and they're looked down upon. Now, I think that statement is worth unpacking, because why is it that these women are single, especially if they desire to get married? And now we have to look at cultural influences. We have to look at, were these women even taught? If they're in Black America, if you're referring to like Black church, a lot of these women were not taught how to be wives. They were not. A lot of them were encouraged to be single. Or maybe they had like super like holier than thou big mamas or whatever in their family who were telling them they needed to be married, but weren't actually showing them and modeling them how to do it. So like they're like marriage culture, teaching people how to be white. Again, these are not necessarily like inherent qualities in the Black American family, just because y'all understand like Black American family specifically, in the West, it's been under attack since day one, starting from slavery. We weren't even allowed to get married. Like, we kind of had to like fake our own marriages to jump on the broom, but like it wasn't a thing. And then even the different policies after slavery, everything from no man in the house clause. Obviously, we know the crack era that disproportionately targeted men. The prison epidemic, like just all these different things, welfare, and all these different things that basically continue to drive a wedge between men and women, to the point to where in the 70s, you had folks reporting on the quote unquote vanishing Black family. This has been an issue for generations. So what he's saying of like, oh, they get to a certain age and that people think there's something wrong with them, yada, yada. I think we have to start to dig a little deeper and ask why. Because the reality is there is a larger trend in America, period, of people not getting married. And we understand in the kingdom of God, we're not necessarily supposed to be following the trends of the world. Just because everybody else isn't getting married does not necessarily mean that God's people aren't supposed to be coming together in covenant in marriage, because that's something that God created. It's valuable to him. So if we see the church taking on the same trend that the rest of society is, then why? And I think that is a question that really needs to be asked first before we just say, stop putting all this pressure on women. Because I think it's a little deeper than that. Anyways, those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. Leave your questions, comments, concerns in the comment section below. Thank you so much for listening if you've gotten this far, and we'll talk later. Bye.